The battle for Idlib, the Syrian government and its main ally Russia appear to be preparing for an all-out offensive. For the rebels, it would likely be the last stand after more than 7 years of fighting. Beyond the military and human cost, what will an assault on Idlib tell us about Syria's future? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. Syria's civil war may soon end, but not without one final humanitarian crisis, as the government of Bashar al Assad has reclaimed one city and region after another. Its opponents have been driven into ever smaller areas. Many are now concentrated in the northern province of Idlib. Recent statements from the government and its ally Russia have hinted that a push to retake this last major rebel-held area may begin soon. We begin with this report from Staffan de Mistura, who is just across the border from Idlib in the Turkish city of Antakya.
All eyes now on the rebel-held province of Idlib. The Syrian government has always said it was going to take it back, and it seems an offensive is now imminent. What form will this offensive take? That remains the question. Will it be limited? Will it be an all-out war? Well, there's intensive negotiations going on behind the scenes between Turkey, between the Russians, and also rebel groups on the ground, particularly a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, this group, formerly associated with Al-Qaeda, known as the Nusra Front, that is the main issue. This is what Russia and Syria say are terrorists and why they're going to be undertaking this offensive. Well, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, put their number at around 10,000 fighters. But of course, more importantly, is the humanitarian situation. Almost 3 million people are inside Idlib province. Half of those are people internally displaced from other conflict zones inside Syria. Also, a lot of people who left areas under these so-called reconciliation deals, rebels and their families who didn't want to stay in government-controlled areas, came to Idlib. They now have nowhere to go. So there's talk of potential humanitarian corridors. Where will they go? Because there's no more opposition-held territory. People are terrified of what will happen to them if they cross into regime areas. And of course, the borders here in Turkey remain firmly shut. Turkey's nightmare situation is of tens of thousands of people begging to be left inside Turkey. Already hundreds of thousands of tents of internally displaced line the border. So this is why intensive negotiations going on. Turkey trying to avoid an all-scale offensive, but we're going to have to wait and see how exactly this is going to play out and when.
Here's what's at stake in Idlib province, the last major rebel enclave. Russia has called it a hotbed of terrorists. UN envoy Staffan de Mistura believes 10,000 Al-Qaeda-linked fighters are there. It's home to nearly 3 million people, almost half of them displaced from territory recaptured by the Syrian government, including Aleppo, eastern Ghouta and Deraa province. NATO has reported a Russian naval buildup in the Mediterranean Sea, where Russia is holding exercises from Saturday. Let's introduce our panel of experts. In Amman, Mamoun Abu Nawar, a military analyst and retired Air Force general. In Moscow, Alexei Klebnikov, a Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. And in London, Hyde, a consulting research fellow on Syria at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. These seem to be quite significant moment in Syria. Mr. Abu Nawar, do you think that a final push to recapture Idlib is just a matter of days or weeks?
Diplomacy is working right now with the negotiation, also with the militant there. But the question is whether the offense will start or precede the summit in Tehran, which is going to be next week in Tehran. This is the great thing. And this might lead to, I could say, diplomacy might be too late to react. But I think there is some strategic points which Assad is really want to get back. It is Sahl al-Ghab, Jisr al-Shughur, and south part of Idlib. And mainly the highways, the autostrad M5 and M4, these are very strategic for him. So it's high likely we might see a very limited attack getting this area back, and Turkey might give some territorial concession with the understanding with Tehran meeting, I think, to get the central of Idlib and the border with the Syria, of course. But it's high likely we might see some attacks or some offense, launching some offense on this area which I mentioned.
Alexei, when you see the Russian naval buildup in the Mediterranean, coupled with statements from the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs saying that Russia is determined to wipe out Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Idlib, is this a genuine indication that Russia is going to go to war in Idlib, or is just trying to put more pressure on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
Well, the situation is not that simple. In the first place, of course, Russia is committed to its consistent policy of eliminating terrorists in the first place. But also we need to remember that in recent months, Russia declared a new priority in Syria, which is the return of the refugees, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction. So if we hypothesize and assume that Russia and Damascus are preparing a large-scale offensive on Idlib, that will definitely produce another huge refugee flow, which goes contrary to Moscow's interests and also to Turkey's interests. So this is why, as my colleague already mentioned, I think now the negotiations between Russia, Turkey, and Damascus are going, trying to find a delicate deal, agreement, which will define how large military intervention against Jabhat al-Nusra is going to be in the area, and how to minimize all possible consequences and risks connected with that.
Haid, I mean, it's the talk of the town now, Idlib and its future. What's the general sentiment among the Syrians now, as everyone seems to be preparing for this final military push?
Well, if we talk mainly about those who are staying in the area that will soon be attacked, people there are scared because they don't know what will happen to them. The first concern is that there is no safe place for them to go to, because Turkey closed the border and will most likely not allow anyone to cross to Turkey, and because second, the regime and Russia has been systematically targeting civilian facilities. So even though they are not on the front lines, their areas might still be targeted. The other thing is basically their humanitarian aid will most likely be cut and terminated because of the security situation. So most of them who depend on that to survive will most likely have to find either another way or to survive without it, which will be extremely difficult. As for the rest of Syrians who either stay in regime-controlled areas or they are refugees outside, they don't know what the capture of Idlib will mean for the future of Syria. Will that basically embolden Assad to say that there will be no more political talks in Syria, or will that at least be a first step into reaching some sort of agreement with Turkey and with the Syrian opposition to at least provide some sort of deal that will allow Assad to stay but will allow others to survive?
Mr. Abu Nawar, I mean, you've said that diplomacy could bear some fruits, and we might not see any military confrontation. However, let's talk about all the possible scenarios. If diplomacy collapses, what would be the next step? Are we going to see something similar to past scenarios by the Russians and the Syrians, where they besiege areas into starvation and submission?
Yes, it's high likely we're going to see that. Like, the thing is, Nusra, Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham, doesn't have two options. Either they fight to death or surrender to the regime, and there is no place to go if they surrender. I mean, the Idlib is quite different from other areas. Normally, they put them in the bus and they deport them to Idlib. But here, there's no place to go, and Turkey will close the border, as you just saying, and she won't allow to get the center of Idlib or the border because of that's its strategic depth concerning the YPG and the Kurd issue. So I think Jabhat al-Nusra is advocating to go ahead for the fighting, but I don't think Jabhat al-Nusra is realizing that they don't have an answer for the air supremacy of the Russian air power, which is completely, they're going to devastate and wipe them off. And thus they should be considered very highly. The other option is Turkey is willing to push the Free Syrian Army, Jabhat al-Wataniyya, to fight the Nusra. I don't think this is it's going to happen, and Turkey would not put herself in such situation. So this is the situation now, but I think high likely we'll see some strike and possibly a limited fight, and then we'll see some settlement concerning Nusra to dissolve it or dismantle it and getting into business with the other part.
Alexei, if this comes down to a final military push, would it be different than what we've seen in places like Eastern Ghouta and Aleppo?
Well, it's true that during the last years we saw quite a familiar pattern of Syrian government and Russia's dealing with de-escalation zones. First it was East Aleppo, then East Ghouta, and lastly it was Deraa. But it's worth noticing that over this time, Russia's involvement was limited to limited airstrikes in support of Syrian government forces attacks. So now, when Idlib is the last remaining de-escalation zone, which is not under Assad's control, Russia definitely wants it to be under this control. But the entire story is different with this because Turkey is involved. Then Kurdish issue is also on the agenda here in this issue. And this is why it's more complicated.
Okay.
So on the one hand, Moscow needs to continue its consistent approach to demonstrate that it backs its ally and wants it to take the territory. But then Turkey is a partner, important partner for Russia, and it also needs to take into account its own interests.
Okay. Haid, the most powerful man in Idlib, Mohammed al-Jawlani, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, said basically of the Nusra Front, said basically that his group is determined to fight to the death in Idlib. Is this something that could give us an indication about what might happen next in Idlib?
Well, definitely, because first of all, we have to take into consideration that the basically manpower that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has, but also the manpower that other groups have in Idlib, whether we are talking about the more even radical groups than Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, like Hurras al-Din and others, or we're talking about groups that are less radical and more moderate, like Jabhat al-Wataniyya and other groups. So in total, if you talk about the numbers there, we have more than 40 to 50,000 fighters, and that number we didn't see in other places. So for sure, we'll most likely see basically more resistance on the ground and more destruction on all sides. That's one issue. The other issue is that, as the other two guests said, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and many other rebel groups don't have any other option but to fight. And I disagree a bit with what the two guests said so far about the whole fight is about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because it's not completely true. Russia and the regime want to eliminate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but also they want to eliminate other rebel groups who are controlling those areas, because the ultimate goal for the regime is to restore its authority over Idlib, and that can only be done if all groups are eliminated.
Abu Nawar, I would like to talk a little bit about the regional implications. We have three bigger players with different agendas: Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Is it possible to see the three countries, when they meet in Tehran, set aside their differences and agree on the future of Syria with Bashar al Assad still in power? The price would ultimately be defeating the rebels in Idlib.
Yes, but let me highlight here a very important point, saying that the rebels or the militant, Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham or others, they're like contractors now to a foreign nation, foreign players, so they don't have their decision or their destiny or decide what's going to happen in the future of Syria. They don't have any military or political project, let me say, or a vision for the end game in Syria now. In any right, you know, Russia would like to keep the partnership with Turkey. She's very careful about, and she wants to get Turkey, you know, some space between NATO and Turkey or distance out. And they're supporting Turkey in a way, in a diplomatic manner or an economical matter. And you have this SO-400 and etc. and the military aid which like to support Turkey. But as Iran would like also to get this area back because this it's their bases there, etc. So I think they have some understanding in the future what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But that's all pending concerning reconstruction of Syria and rehabilitation of Syria and retaining of refugees. And how come they support such a brutal regime to kill his people back again? This is the problem. And I don't think the European or other nation will support Assad or Russia. And Russia, it doesn't have the resources to build Syria again. And she's in deep trouble now. That will sort of take her, you know, drain her resources in Syria. So this is very important, logical point. And you don't have any UN peace plan, peace political process for Syria. It's all dead now.
Okay.
Assad is winning the game, and he would negotiating with whom? This is what the big question now.
Okay.
And how will be the end game or the structure, or how Syria war will end? This is the problem. Assad is not committed for peace, and he will keep on killing, and no people, Syrian people, will come back under his rule.
Alexei, if the Turks decide to give the go-ahead for the military push by the Russians and the Syrian government in Idlib, what would be the price Russia would pay? Would they, for example, allow the Turkish government to have some sort of political influence in the northern part of Syria?
I think it's definitely on the agenda and under discussion now. Because, as I see it, I think that Moscow, Ankara, and Damascus, the three of them want limited joint military offensive which targets particularly the radical groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra. So this is why, I mean, they're in quite intensive negotiation mode, as we witnessed a week ago. Turkish foreign minister together with defense minister and head of Turkish intelligence were in Moscow, and they discussed Idlib, exactly Idlib. And in 7 days we have a summit, trilateral summit in Tehran, where Idlib will also top the agenda, as well as the Kurdish issue, the reconstruction and the return of the refugees.
Mm-hmm. Hyde, 7 years ago, when the Syrians took to the streets, there were high hopes that their movement would lead to a new, vibrant, democratic Syria. 7 years later, with these talks about a final push to take back Idlib, do you believe, is this a feeling that many Syrians feel this is the beginning of the end for the rebels?
Well, for the rebels, it is most likely the beginning of the end, and many people know that, because even though the rebels in Idlib might be able to resist, but they can only do that for so long. So at the end, they know that they will be defeated militarily. So the question right now is, what will happen after that, and will Russia or the international community be able to pressure the regime in order to reach some sort of political deal that is accepted by all groups? And I think it's important to highlight here that we're only talking about Idlib and rebels-controlled areas, but we have to also talk about Kurdish-controlled areas, which consists of more than 25% of Syria. Mm-hmm. And taking over Idlib will not solve that issue, because the regime has been basically having negotiations with those groups, but the negotiations are not going anywhere. And so that will be another issue to discuss. But in general, people feel that military confrontation with the regime is not available, it's not possible anymore. Okay. And that's why the only demand left is the political
way out. Mr. Abu Nawa, you've said that the air superiority of the Russians will make a difference, but the Russians are notorious for the massive scale operations that leave behind thousands of civilian casualties, massive destruction. Isn't this something that could create yet another huge humanitarian issue in Syria?
It is a catastrophe. If this happened, a massive scale operation, that's madness. I mean, there are 3 to 4 million people. Where did they go? And this will threat also European and the Turkey as this is a big thing to do. And I don't think this is a high likely scenario that's what we're going to see. I think it's going to be a very limited attack, getting these points which I mentioned back. But that's what we're going to see. A massive scale operation, that's crazy, the craziness, that's madness to do this. It's an atrocity for the Syrian people. I mean, where did they go? Where did they go?
Alexei, the Russians seem to be impressed by their military capabilities. In 2015, they stepped in and they changed the ground. They tilted the ground in favor of Bashar al Assad. But even if Bashar al Assad takes back Idlib, 80% of the Syrian population still wants Assad out of power. We're back to square one.
Well, the statistic firstly polls where it comes from, so I don't know. But we need to see, of course, the UN process under the UN auspices and the elections and then transition period, which actually Russia advocates for and supports. But what Moscow views as a prerequisite for that is the pacification of the conflict, which means the end of the fight. So to create conditions where political process could be launched, when the UN can work on the ground to monitor elections or organize election process. So this is what Moscow eventually pushes for.
Haid, what is next for you, the millions of people who live in no man's land in Syria or pushed out of their country if Bashar al-Assad claims back most of the territory in Syria? Would you still continue the fight?
Well, first of all, for those who live in Idlib, they will for sure not feel safe because many of them are wanted for the regime. And even if the regime has been able to take over Idlib, the risk doesn't end there. The risk begins for many after that because they will be either arrested or killed at a later stage. As for those who live outside of Syria, many people said that publicly. We will not be able to go back as refugees for many reasons. First, because we are scared of what might the regime do, and second, because there is no options for us to go back to, meaning that there is no jobs, their houses, most of them are destroyed, and many of the areas where they come from are completely empty and besieged right now still by the regime, like Deraa, close to Damascus. So the conditions for their return don't exist, and this is why many people feel that this will be just another basically page that they have to turn, but their suffering will continue for a long time.
Haid, Alexei Klebnikov, Mamoun Abu Nawa, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahalbara, the whole team here. Bye for now.